Thank you, Pat. Thank you for kind invitation to come and join you today. My name's Asad Rehman. I'm the director at War and Want. If you don't know War and Want, we're, term ourselves a radical charity. We're a leading organisation that works around on the root causes of poverty, inequality and injustice. We work directly with frontline communities all across the world, make partnerships with workers' organisations, trade unions, and we run, of course, hard-hitting campaigns here in this country. And over the incredible, we've been around for about 65 years. You might know our slogan, poverty is political and justice not charity. And we've launched many a groundbreaking campaign, and we've been, of course, at the forefront and very central to the fight around climate injustice. And I really wanted to maybe start now with something that actually Greta Thunberg said when she spoke at the US Congress a couple of weeks ago. And she said, we need dreams, we cannot live without dreams, but there's a time and place for everything. But we are telling ourselves bedtime stories that soothe us and make us go back to sleep. And I think it's important because, of course, we're all comrades here, right? The reason we're here is we know the fight that we're fighting. So part of this, I think, is us having a conversation together. So in honour, not just of Greta, but also the millions of people in the global south who've been fighting around climate injustice for many a long year. It's really important we do tell the truth. We join the dots between the climate exploitation and the systemic exploitation of the poorest in the world. But we should know whose truth, because often you hear this word, right? We should tell the truth. But whose truth are we telling? Because, I was used to be often told when I was working for Friends of the Earth with other environmental organisations, they would often tell me, people in the environment would often use this analogy, you might have heard it, we're all on the Titanic and we've hit the proverbial climate iceberg. And I always used to say, well, we might all be on the Titanic, but on the deck of the Titanic are the citizens of the global north, still sipping cocktails, right? Still listening to the orchestra, and many of them still hoping for some miracle technological answer. And in the hold of the Titanic are the global south, black, brown people, the poorest people in the world, already drowning. And when they try and escape, they find that the holds are barred shut. Because that truth, whilst it is true we are all going to be impacted by the climate crisis, the realities are very, very different, and we all know that. And so it's really important we remind ourselves of that. And I don't need to, the fact that you're all here, we don't need to go over looking, you don't need to be a climate scientist now to know what the impacts are at just a 1 degree warming of the planet. We know you can, look at Bahamas or Puerto Rico or Dominica flattened by a single hurricane, or Mozambique, where one storm, one super cyclone has left, not just destroyed 90% of the major port city, but 2 weeks ago with UNHCR, announced, made an appeal where 1 million people are still on the brink of starvation, right? Not necessarily directly impacted immediately from just the storm, but of the fact that that state, Mozambique, one of the poorest in the world, is now unable to cope and deal with the impacts and the aftermath of that. I'm originally from Pakistan. We've had a heat wave in Pakistan, 53.5 degrees centigrade. You might have heard over the summer that Chennai, the 5th biggest city in India, ran out of water. It's now predicted that 40% of the Indian subcontinent, 1.3 billion citizens in India will be without access to fresh water by 2030, which will have huge impacts, not only in terms of course, people's access to fresh water, but of course also around on food production. The story is the same in every single corner of the world. We are seeing the reality of this climate crisis impacting not tomorrow, not in the future, not for our children or our grandchildren, but the reality now for many, many people. And the calculations, you can say, some people say millions are already dying. It's really hard because one of the things, of course, that climate crisis does, it fuels all other existing inequalities. Now, we could all recognise that, of course, there was a seismic moment in 2018 when the IPCC published their report on the impacts of warming of 1.5, which was a demand from countries in the global south and from movements in the global south. And it set out what would happen if we breached the 1.5, that we would trigger feedback loops, what the impacts would be on food production, what it would mean in terms of the economies of the global south. I mean, it set it all out quite well in terms of also the extreme impacts that we would see in terms of the frequency of extreme weather impacts. And out of that, I mean, of course, it sparked huge movements, right? Both from Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for the Future, they were directly linked in terms of that. And it's interesting because, of course, you could say that sent a sense of moral panic through the global north. But I want to say something a little bit about that climate science. So I presume everybody here has seen the famous champagne glass, right? The one that Auckland, of a global emissions. That's champagne glass at the top, 10% of the world's population responsible for 50% of emissions, and the champagne glass gets narrower and narrower and narrower down to the bottom, where 50% of the world's population, the poorest part of the world, 3.5 billion people, are only responsible for 10% of emissions. And that, of course, has gone a lot around the environment movement and the climate movement. But if you overlay that with another champagne glass, the champagne glass of inequality, it's a very, very interesting thing happens. You find that that same 10% of the world's population, the richest 10%, are the ones that have amassed more than half of the global wealth. The poorest 50% are the ones that have got between them less than 8% of global wealth. Right? And if you overlay that with people surviving on $5 a day, that's half the world's population, 3.5 billion. If you overlay that with the 3.3 billion people who don't have access to electricity or clean cooking, that's where it sits, or the 2 billion people who will go hungry, or the 1 billion people without access to water. You suddenly realise that actually this is not simply a question about carbon. This is actually a much bigger question about the world we live in and how we got here. And I think that's really, really important, because it's important for us to tell that story, right? The second part I just want to say about the climate science, and of course, one of the things that the IPCC said was the world needs to be at zero by 2050, and of course, lots of rich countries, including our own, the UK, basically said, of course, well, we'll be zero or net zero by 2050. It's just basically carbon colonialism, right? We are taking we've already overconsumed our fair share of the carbon. We're now taking it off the poorest people in the world. If the fair share of the UK is about minus 202% by 2030, that's what we would have to do. We'd have to cut to zero and then provide finance to the poorest people in the world. Right? That's the reality of our fair share, and we've done an equity calculator which shows that. The second thing, of course, is this word about net. And one of the things about in all the modelling of the IPCC is it assumes huge amounts of net, which is negative emissions technology, which is this idea that you can pump carbon into the atmosphere and then find somehow a way to suck it back out, right? Now, even if you, and none of us know what happens if you put the dial of the temperature up and then try and bring it down. Nobody knows what happens. What we do know is there is no proven technology for negative emissions technology to scale. The only one that exists on the ground at the moment is bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which is when you grow things and use that to produce your energy. One thing we know, it requires 3 times the landmass of India to be able to do that. Right? When we know that billions are without hunger, so who's going to pay the price in terms of that? So we have to be careful that the net argument doesn't allow mad, bad, dangerous things to actually happen in its name. Now, there are very good negative emission technology, one, which is, of course, reforestation, right? But we know also planting trees takes 30 years, right? So as a get out of jail, it's increasingly become a get out of jail for many people, right? And you see this with companies. If you're on Twitter and you tweet, you'll see your Twitter feed always having sponsored ads by Shell and BP talking about how they're all going to negative emissions. And that's basically what they're saying. We'll carry on our business practices as usual, and somehow and somewhere we'll carry on and we'll plant a few trees and everything will look away. That's absolutely palpably untrue. The second thing I also wanted to just quickly say is, it's interesting also about, people talk about the UK Climate Change Committee, which produced the net zero 2050 for the UK. Its starting point wasn't the science, and neither was its starting point fairness or equity. Its starting point was what would cause the least disruption to the UK economy. how would we start with only spending 2% of our GDP? So it wasn't, this is what we needed for science, justice or equity. And that's really important, because I think unless we start from that foundation of understanding what's actually happening, we don't find the right solutions that we need to be able to move forward. Now, I just want to say something also about that carbon budget. So the IPCC calculated now that there's 360 tonnes of CO2 left that we can basically continue to pollute, which is about 8.5 years of the pollution that we can do, which is, again, only a 50-50 chance of preventing the 1 degree, breaching the 1 degree target. If you actually were saying we're deadly serious, then we're talking about 4 or 4.5 years before we breach the 1.5 degree target. And again, that's really important. It's not to depress people, but it's to recognise the scale of the urgency of what we're actually talking about. And that, of course, is a huge challenge, right? We have an economy that is built on fossil fuels, not fossil fuels built on it. Our economy was shaped around fossil fuels and fossil fuel extraction of wealth and resources. And that's really important, because when we try and solve this crisis, you know, we have to recognise what we're trying to solve is not a climate crisis. What we're trying to solve is a crisis of inequality and injustice, because the solutions to both are very, very different. Because if you want to try and solve the climate crisis and draw a straight line and condemn half the world to poverty and inequality, it is possible to do that. It's called lifeboat, right? We build our lifeboat, we protect our citizens in the global north, and we don't do anything about the global south. And of course, people in the global south are not going to accept that. They're not going to go quietly into the dark. They are making demands, and they will continue to make demands. And of course, us as a movement have to be able to respond to those demands. And that's why, as a movement, we're always connected. We are part of a global movement. We're not a movement that's just there in the global north. And so I want to touch on, and I know sometimes people are like, well, you know, we have to talk about climate only in a way that is understandable and accessible. But between all of us, we have to recognise that, you know, the reason why we're here is because there's an arc of history, right? It's an arc of history of an economic system that is prefaced on the idea of exploiting resources of people and natural resources of the global south. Now, we can go back, right? I mean, the UK, just to tell you, is the 5th, you know, biggest economy in the world, richest economy. It's not richest economy because of some particularly ingenuity of British people. It's because it was a peculiarly brutal colonial master of the world, right? I mean, that's where its wealth has come from, right? It comes from absolutely everything. If you look at, you know, you can take the arc back to slavery, for example, and British traders, British merchants were responsible for enslaving 1.5 million people from Africa, right? That wealth was £8 billion is what was made from slavery. The slave merchants and the slave traders were the richest people in this country. They invested in every single road, the canals, the infrastructure of this country, from the libraries at the universities to financing inventors like James Watt. Right? I mean, they invested in absolutely everything. It's calculated in 1770, £4 million per year was being invested into the British economy. 3.8 million was coming from slavery. Right? So you literally can say that people of the global south and the slaves built this country. And you can talk also, you know, you don't have to go back to slavery. We can talk about during colonialism, right? During Britain's control of just the Indian subcontinent. During that period, it is calculated that Britain took out of India £45 trillion. That's 16 times the GDP of the UK. Right? When Britain went to India, India's share of the global GDP was about 24.4%. When it left, it had fallen to less than 4%. Right? This is the extraction, and if you can look at all the way through, it's the extraction of resources that fuels. And it's said that just from India, let alone what's taken out of Africa or the Caribbean or anywhere else, that Britain never financed a single war by itself. It all came from the extraction of wealth from India. And it financed capital expansion, not just in Britain, but in Australia, Canada, and all around the world. So again, the idea of this resource extraction is so built into the system, right? So thinking that we can think about climate change separate from our economic system is a real challenge, and it's a real problem. It's a mistake we can't make. Because for a long time, the reason why we're here I would say the reason why we're in this point is because actually large parts of our movement tried to do that. They said climate change was not something that was political. Climate change was simply about policy pragmatism. We would talk rationally to governments. Governments would rationally respond and they would do something. And that for 20, 30 years is what we were told, right? That's what was called elite advocacy. So that's all that we needed to do. Publish another report, one more report, one more report. And having spent 10 years at the UN climate talks, working with developing countries, I'll tell you, I've sat in meetings with both governments and NGOs, many UK NGOs, one largely being the only non-white person in the room, but what's been fascinating for me is actually, often I couldn't tell the difference between the government and the NGO, in terms of not just the language, but the policy pragmatism. And I used to be told, well, I said, you're just too radical. You've got to learn to live within this system. And I always say, well, it's very easy to say that when you're not dying from that system. And if you start from a point of the global south, you would not be saying, how do we square this policy pragmatism? You would be talking about a much more radical vision. And I now just want to talk a little bit more about that. So it is great, and it's absolutely brilliant that over the last year we've seen this huge explosion of direct action, and XR on the streets, and the youth climate strike, and it has changed, and it's put climate change into and onto the political agenda. But we have to have a vision, right? We have to have not just a vision of this is what we need. We need concrete vision with political demands. Because you can't build a movement without a vision, and you can't build a movement without some concrete political demands. So I want to just outline some of those political demands, right? So one of them, of course, as we know, we of course say we must end fossil fuels. Absolutely, we must end fossil fuels. But this is an economy like the UK. It's 22% of the British economy, of the GDP of Britain, comes from the City of London. A third of all of the shares on the FTSE 100 are from the extractive industry. We have a report over there called New Colonialism, which shows that British companies, they control £1 trillion worth of mineral wealth of Africa, more than the whole of the GDP of all sub-Saharan countries in Africa. It's hardwired into our economic system. So simply saying we must end fossil fuel, and then thinking and making a mistake and then saying, well, what we can do is simply have 100% renewable energy. Well, there is two challenges for us. So energy demand is expected to increase by 40% globally. We have to reduce our energy demand by about 40%. And at the same time, we're also saying that all of this new renewable energy that we want has to find new metals and minerals, right? Cobalt, it's predicted that's about 428% of known reserves of cobalt, 300% of lithium. We need huge amounts of tons of copper and metals. All of this has to come, again, from extraction. Now, the world has told us, scientists said a sustainable extraction of natural resources from the planet is about 50 million tons. It's now predicted by 2030 will be 120 million tons. Behind every ton is a new story of extraction, of human rights violations, human rights defenders. And I'll tell you, a couple of months ago, we were in with the AGM of Anglo-American, one of the biggest sort of mining companies, who are about to start a new huge copper mine in Chile, right? 40,000 tons of copper taken out of the ground each and every year. Huge impacts on the glaciers, huge impacts on water for about 6 million people. And Anglo-Americans' answer to the fact that local communities are there were, well, we are part of the just transition. We are the future. So I think we have to start to think about energy in a very, very different way. We have to start thinking about energy, like climate, as an issue of the global commons. So it's no good just for us in the global north to say, we should own our energy. We should have community energy. Absolutely, we know that that's really important, but we should also be thinking about, what is productive energy, what is useful, and how do people in the global south have access and control of energy. So our demands have to go beyond our nation state, because it's an impossibility for us to solve this crisis within our own nation state. And it's brilliant that there is now more and more conversations around green deals. Absolutely, it's finally happening that people are connecting the fight against social justice with climate justice, because one of our biggest challenges has been to answer that question that one of the yellow vest protesters said when they came out after Macron put the carbon tax up. You may have seen when the big, huge protest was taking place, and one of the TV interviewers went up to one of the protesters and said, "But isn't this terrible, the climate crisis, and you're protested against this carbon tax?" And he said, "Well, the elites, they worry about the end of the world. Us ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month." And that for us is a real challenge, right? Which is why our climate fight has to also be a fight around inequality and injustice. And it's the same about when we talk about food, right? We know the reality about food, right? Second biggest emitter of emissions is industrial agribusiness. But let me tell you, 80% of the world's population, they're fed by agroecology on less than 24% of land. In Africa, it's between 11 and 19% of land. The rest of agricultural land is given over to commodities that flow to the global north. So when we start to talk about, food, our answer isn't about us changing simply what's in our wardrobe and what's on our plate. It's actually thinking about how do we dismantle the agribusiness? How do we ensure that we have agroecology? How do we start talking about the right to food, like the right to energy? And the same is true in terms around living wages, right? How do we ensure that in this country, and I say we, I don't know, Scotland, but we in the UK, the UK has got something like, of the top 71% of the FTSE 100 companies are domiciled in the UK. Something similar about Fortune 500. They are here. They're our banks and they're our corporations. And since the Paris Agreement, banks have have invested 1.7 trillion into fossil fuel corporations ever since the Paris Agreement. And remember, the Paris Agreement, for all what it was lauded, leads us to a warming of the planet of at least 3.4 up to 7 degrees warming. That's what the pledges are within the climate targets that are out there. So, I don't know how long I've waited on for, but I won't... look, our big challenge, not just in terms of then thinking about, how do we talk about a global deal for people, or how do we connect our fights, not just about fossil fuels, but our fight with fossil fuels around the fight around in terms of food, and the right to food with the right to a living wage, and the right to public services. Now, that might sound like, that's really... But you know what the most important measure for people who are being impacted by the climate crisis in the global south is? What determines whether you live, die, what the decisions you make, is of course your economic security. Do you have any income coming in? And do you have any public services? Do you have health, education, housing? They are the most fundamental thing. And why do they not occur in the global south? Because our government, which led the neoliberal charge, which led the structural adjustment programs, has gutted a majority of countries in the global south. We have not allowed them the ability. So Mozambique, when it was hit by the cyclone, you know what Mozambique had to do? They came to the City of London and had to beg for debt-creating loans to be able to deal with the crisis that they have not created. So already the banks and their answers, of course, is more debt creation, more creating of loans. Right? So it is really important that at this moment, when everybody is saying, I believe in the climate emergency, we don't allow the climate emergency to be used in a way that replicates the same injustices and the same extraction of wealth and resources. So we have a huge opportunity now, collectively, and you more so, because the COP is going to come here next year. Right? Our movements from all around the world will be here. Right? We're not Poland, we're not Chile, we're the 5th richest economy in the world, 5th biggest emitter historically of all emissions, 3rd highest consumer of resources per capita than any other country in the OECD. So our responsibility is to be able to shape and change the conversation we've begun, which is about the climate emergency, to one which is now about what is the transformation that we need to start to see, and to build that transformation and to recognise the interconnections between all of our struggles. I think there's an interesting thing that came out of XR, right? We need to build a movement of movements. But you can only build a movement of movements when people see their struggles connected into those fights. You can't build a movement of movement by us saying, this is the climate crisis, everybody must come to us, if within our narrative and discourse and our demands, people can't see their own issues reflected, can't see their struggles being reflected. Otherwise, we go back to being an elite movement of, yes, very, very concerned people, but without the social license for the transformation that needs to happen. And that social license for the transformation has to go beyond trying to tinker with the existing system, to actually thinking beyond it. And I think it's one of the most incredible things that neoliberalism has done to all of us, and I include myself in everybody, is taken away our imaginations. It's taken away our ability to be able to think of society and an economy that is different than the one that we've got. And to think we created neoliberalism, right? The UK was one of the main architects of neoliberalism, but we created the economy as such. So the answer is not to simply say we should get the cars off the road, petrol and diesel, and have 2.5 million electric vehicles on the road. Our answer should be, we want free public transport, electrified, renewable transport. Our answer should be to the climate crisis, not simply saying it's about poor days or whatever, but actually start saying it's about warm homes for people. It's actually about living wages for people. It's about public investment in public services, but not as an add-on for the international, not as an add-on for everybody else. If it's good enough for us to have an NHS here, we should be calling for a global NHS. If we're calling for an education service here, we can call for a global education service. And whilst that sounds magical, right, at one level, the cost of it is tiny. It's actually all feasibly, all realistic. There's no problem at all. What is lacks is the political will. And I want to just end now by just giving you one last bomb that it blows my mind. I was thinking about it on the way here. You know, if somebody, on the day that Columbus went to discover what was not lost, right, was paid $5,000 a day, from then to now, every single day, 365, that would not still make that person a billionaire. Bezos, who owns Amazon, makes that in 4 days. That's the world of inequality. That's why when we say this movement, I always ask, you know, we have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to save and what are we trying to build? If we're trying to save the world that is this world, I'm sorry, you're going to lose a lot of people. But if you want to fight for a world which is different, which is located in the global south, which gives everybody a right to a dignified life, then we have the ability to be able to build the kind of power that's needed for this transformation. Thank you.